I'm Niranjan Rajadhyaksha. I'm the Research Director and Senior Fellow at IDFC Institute, which is a think tank based in Mumbai. Today I will be speaking on India's tryst with national planning. India's tryst with centralized national planning is a long story, it's an interesting story, and it is also a slightly depressing story of missed opportunities. The story actually begins well before India became an independent country. The first attempt at national planning was in 1934 when M. Visvesvaraya, who was then Diwan of Mysore state, published a plan to double India's national income in 10 short years. That could be called the first attempt at national planning in India. Then in 1938, Subhash Chandra Bose became the president of the Indian National Congress, and he appointed a committee headed by Jawaharlal Nehru to formulate a national plan for India's economic development. Then in 1944, a group of very powerful and influential Indian business leaders produced what has now been called the Bombay Plan, which again called for the state to plan for development. And finally, in the same year, that is 1944, an economist called Shriman Narayan Agarwal published a Gandhian plan for economic development. The point I'm trying to make is that the planning idea had taken root in India well before we actually formally began planning. There were two big intellectual influences at that time. The first was the New Deal in America, where President Roosevelt tried to increase the role of the state in the management of the American economy. And then, of course, there was the Soviet industrialization experiment. Today, we know about all its flaws and its trampling of human rights, but at that point of time, it had a certain intellectual resonance across the world. So now the story moves on into our actual experience with national planning. In 1950, the Planning Commission was set up by a cabinet order. By that time, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who was opposed to the idea of national planning, had passed away. Rajaji had left active politics of the Congress. Gandhi was no longer around. So Nehru was more or less in charge of giving direction to economic policy. And Nehru was always attracted by the idea of national planning. So the first plan was kicked off in 1951. So the first phase of Indian planning, what I call the high noon of Indian planning, was the first plan, the second plan, and the third plan. Now, what was the basic goal at that point of time? The first was to rapidly increase investments in India. So while India had a very low savings rate, the idea was to use deficit financing and foreign aid to rapidly increase industrial investment. The second was who was going to do this investment. It was not the private sector, it was state. So the state was supposed to capture the commanding heights of the economy and build steel plants, fertilizer plants, machine goods industries. And the third distinctive feature of Indian planning was that it was not just investment in any part of the economy, it was supposed to be focused on what are called capital goods industries. The idea was that India should first produce machines and then consumer goods. And this had two goals. One obviously was to create industrial capacity, but also to make India independent for its own strategic needs. So that was what is called the high noon of Indian planning, the first plan, second plan, and third plan. There was actually some success, and we'll discuss that later, but also the genesis of the future failures. The second phase actually becomes a little different. After the third plan, India had a tough time from 65 or 66 onwards. There was a war with China, there was a war with Pakistan, there were two droughts. So India went into a period of what is called plan holiday. There were no plans there were only annual plans, there were no 5-year plans. Then the second phase of planning starts. which is the fourth plan and the fifth plan. Now, how are these two plans different from the previous plan, which is the first, second, and third? I think there were two important differences in the 70s. First was that there was a greater focus on agriculture and small scale industry as compared to the earlier plans, which were largely based on heavy industry. And the second was there was a direct attack on poverty. So, a lot of anti poverty programs started coming into the Indian planning process. The earlier plans assumed that with higher growth, poverty would automatically recede. In the 70s, there was a slight shift. Then we come to the next phase, which is the 1980s, which is the sixth plan and the seventh plan. Now, what was distinctive about these plans? By then, it was evident that the earlier strategy had its limits. So, the plans of the 1980s switched focus from just investments to efficiency, productivity, technological upgradation of Indian industry. And then came the last phase, which is post 91, where essentially the reforms led by Manmohan Singh and Narasimha Rao demolished most of the old Nehruvian economic structure, policy structure, and the plans continued, but they were not so central to India's economic development trajectory. So, although the plans were so central to India's development strategy, a question worth asking is that didn't nobody see the flaws in the strategy? Were there no economists dissenting? Actually, there were. And I would mention four very important examples of people and economists who gave early warning signs that India was down the wrong path. The first significant critique of Indian planning was by the famous liberal economist B.R. Shenoy. So in 1955, B.R. Shenoy wrote this famous dissent note to the second five-year plan. And Shenoy made two very important points. The first point he made was the plan was very, very dependent on deficit financing, and that this would eventually lead to high inflation and balance of payments pressures on India. And the second point he made was a slightly more political point, that as the state took over so much of economic power, Indian democracy would be weakened because of the concentration of power with the government of India. Actually, Shenoy, on the first point especially, was bang on target, because the second plan, which was launched in 56, by 57 it ran into trouble. There was a balance of payments crisis as Shenoy had predicted, and India faced inflation problems. So the Shenoy critique is perhaps the first and most famous critique of Indian planning. The second came from the Bombay economists, C.N. Vakil and P.R. Brahmanandl. And as an aside, Professor Brahmanandl was my teacher, so I am taking special pride in mentioning this. So Vakil and Brahmanandl, they questioned the overdependence on capital goods industries, and they presented what is called the wage goods alternative. Now, wage goods are basic consumption goods which people need, which is food, textiles, leather, footwear. Those are the sort of wage goods which they thought India needs to focus on rather than the overdependence on capital goods. So that's the second big critique. The third critique came in 1964 in the PhD thesis of a young Oxford economist called Manmohan Singh. So Manmohan Singh's thesis, which was quite famous, said that India was making a mistake in not focusing on exports. So a lot of the Indian plans were based on what is called export pessimism, that India cannot export and therefore it cannot earn the foreign exchange needed for investment. It had to depend on aid. Now Manmohan Singh questioned this, and as we see later with the success of the export-oriented economies of Asia, that he was onto something there. So that was the third critique, the Manmohan Singh critique about the failure to focus on exports. And the fourth big critique came at the end of the 1970s, of the 1960s rather, when Jagdish Bhagwati, Padma Desai and T.N. Srinivasan basically with very careful empirical studies showed that Indian industry under planning and under the license Raj was not competitive, it was inefficient, there was a waste of resources. So if you look, there are these four big critiques. The Shenoy critique about deficit financing, the Brahmanand Vakil critique about the focus on capital goods, the Manmohan Singh critique about the lack of focus on exports, and then the Jagdish Bhagwati, Padma Desai and T.N. Srinivasan critique on the damages done by the license Raj. Okay, so if we step back now and ask this question, that how did the Indian plans eventually work out? Means, did they benefit India? Did they damage India? My own personal view is, on balance, they did more damage than good. But let's not forget some elements of the good as well. I think what the plans did, especially the earlier plans, was one, they did build industrial capacity in the country. So if you see the record in the 1950s, broadly till 1965, actually Indian industry was growing at 7-8%, and the share of industry in Indian GDP was rapidly changing. So that was one definite benefit. The other was that India built a diversified industrial structure. For a country so poor, India not only had textile mills and the rest of it, but even high-end engineering, steel, capital goods. So they were capabilities being built during these plans. Of course, this was only till 65. By 65, the problems with planning were evident, and in fact, India went into a long industrial stagnation from 65 to 80. And after 80, when Mrs. Gandhi came back, there was some initial opening up of the Indian economy, some reductions in industrial licensing, etc. That's the benefit. But there were massive damages as well. Number one, the Indian planning system eventually led to the creation of this very complex web of import controls, high taxation, the license Raj. So basically, it created this entire burden on Indian private enterprise. The second was the public sector, which was supposed to be profitable soon, and in fact, to generate its own internal surpluses, became a burden on the Indian economy. Third is that Indian industry basically lost competitiveness. It was not able to capture the opportunities which were provided by the expansion of global trade in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. This is precisely the opportunity with countries like Japan, then South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and later even China captured. So basically, the planning process, while it did have some initial success, in the long run, did a lot of damage to India. Now, the question is, what was actually the fundamental problem with Indian planning? The ambition was there, the sort of broad vision was there. I think the liberal economist Peter Bauer put it up very well. He called those Indian plans priceless planning. Now, it's a bit of a joke because priceless can be thought of in two ways. Priceless is something which is beyond value, it's very valuable. It's like a priceless diamond. But there's also another more literal meaning, which is it doesn't have the concept of price. Indian economic plans were largely about physical planning, physical controls, were all about quantities. We have to produce so many tons of steel, so many tractors. It's precisely the problem with the Soviet economy, right? That you had physical plans, but you had no price system. And obviously Hayek had pointed out that this was the fatal conceit, that people sitting in a planning commission can actually decide the structure of production and demand in an economy, especially a dynamic economy. So the Indian plans, what Bauer called priceless planning, the lack of understanding or the lack of appreciation of the role of the price system, the role of the international trading system, I think these were the fundamental flaws in the approach. Even as the plans kept changing, as I said, what was central to the plans was the lack of prices, a focus on quantities, and a complete suspicion of international trade. So if you look now, you see that India, despite the positive early start, missed out the opportunities which country after country in Asia, at least east of India, captured, right? So Japan took off first in the 50s, And India at that point of time did have a lot of private enterprise, did have a, a textile industry, it had automobiles, it had a lot of industries in the private sector. Then Japan took off, then the action moved to the four Asian tigers, then it moved to Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and finally after the 1990s it moved to China. India could not capture that opportunity. I wouldn't say it's all because of planning. There were other factors as well, but I think the Indian planning story tells us something very important about the importance of private enterprise, markets, and free trade. So let's move beyond the immediate Indian experience now. Does planning actually have a role in the modern age? Now, there are two types of planning. There is indicative planning, where a government provides the broad framework for policy and direction of an economy, and there is this detailed planning as what India had. Now, it's not very easy to follow the second strategy in the modern world for two or three reasons. The first is that knowledge in this world is dispersed. It sits with us in the minds of consumers, in the minds of firms, in the minds of suppliers, and it's very difficult for a central body to actually aggregate all this knowledge. That is best left to the market. And despite there are obvious problems of market failures and externalities, the market does a better job in aggregating preferences and knowledge. The second is that knowledge is often tacit. It sits with us, we don't express ourselves. So, as it's famously said about tacit knowledge, that we know more than we can say. So, even if we are asked through surveys, what do you want, or data is collected by the planning agency, people don't actually know how to express their deeper ideas and preferences. So, knowledge, the second thing, knowledge is dispersed, knowledge is tacit. And the third, obviously, is technological change. That as technology changes very rapidly, it's very difficult for a planning agency to actually keep track. Planning plans are very sort of set in stone, so plans are not adaptive. And finally, I think that in an economy, a modern economy where there is a lot of services, especially in the digital economy, how do you have physical plan? How do you plan for Facebook? How do you plan for Google? So planning per se is a flawed idea, especially in the modern world. What I'm talking about is these very detailed plans with everything worked out in a central agency. Now, how do you integrate? Is it possible to integrate prices into plans? Is it possible to get dynamism into plans? There have been attempts, one at decentralized planning, so the planning is not done at the central level, but perhaps at the state level or the municipal level. There's also been some attempt to build models of what are called market socialism. It starts right from the 1920s in Chicago, where prices are driven by the market, or the planning commission has shadow prices. So in the Soviet Union, they did attempt it in the 1970s when they saw that physical planning has its limitations, whether they can have some sort of quasi-pricing system, but it hasn't worked out that well. So while theoretically planning with prices sounds like a good idea, the world has yet not thrown up a solution or an actual experience where centralized planning has worked well with the price system. So there is one outlier here. There are some people who believe that now, with the advent of supercomputers and big data, that it is actually possible for a central information processing hub which will act like the planning commission of the old days. So there will be an algorithm which will actually coordinate economic activity dynamically throughout an economy without depending too much on the price system or the market system. Now, again, as I said, this is an interesting idea. So what we call a general equilibrium model, where all sectors, all enterprises, all workers, all consumers, their preferences are in a way brought into the central processing hub, and it solves for the economic problem and optimizes the use of resources and maximizes consumer welfare. It's an interesting idea, but again, till it is actually tried out, it's very difficult to say. My own guess is that even such a central processing unit which is dynamic, which is based on very powerful algorithms, cannot substitute the basic strengths of a market economy.